James Carter had spent his entire life upholding the law, ensuring justice prevailed in the courtroom. After decades as a federal prosecutor, retirement had finally arrived, and with it, the dream of a peaceful life in a quiet, picturesque neighborhood. He had chosen this place carefully, a charming community with tree-lined streets, friendly neighbors, and homes that carried the warmth of families who had lived there for years. His new house was everything he had wanted: a spacious porch where he could enjoy his morning coffee, a garden where he planned to plant the roses his late wife had loved, and most importantly, a sense of calm that he had long yearned for after years of battling crime and corruption. But life, as James had learned, had a way of testing those who sought peace, and the first sign of trouble came not with a loud bang but with a simple envelope sitting in his mailbox.
A fine.
His brow furrowed as he opened the letter, expecting some clerical mistake, but there it was, printed in bold letters: $500 fine for unauthorized wind chimes. Wind chimes? He glanced up at the small, decorative chime hanging by his porch, a simple piece his daughter had given him as a housewarming gift. It barely made a sound, swaying gently in the breeze, yet here he was, being penalized on his very first week in the neighborhood. Confused but calm, James decided he would look into it. After all, there had to be some misunderstanding. But what he didn't know then was that he had just become the latest target of Gregory Miles, a man who saw himself as the king of the neighborhood, the HOA president who wielded his power like a weapon. Gregory Miles had been running the Homeowners Association for nearly a decade, and in that time, he had turned what was meant to be a community service organization into his own personal empire. A stocky man in his late 50s, Gregory had the smug confidence of someone who had never been challenged, someone who believed himself untouchable. He wore his authority like a badge of honor, patrolling the neighborhood in his golf cart, clipboard in hand, always ready to issue citations. He claimed to be enforcing community standards, but what he was really doing was exerting control, targeting those who wouldn't push back, fining residents for trivial matters while ignoring his own glaring violations. His backyard featured an illegal gazebo, his driveway was stained with oil, and his grass grew an inch too long according to the very bylaws he so aggressively enforced, yet no fines ever landed on his doorstep. The moment James Carter's name appeared on the HOA's new resident list, Gregory had marked him as just another retiree who would grumble but ultimately comply. After all, that's how it always went. New homeowners received a fine almost immediately, a test of their willingness to follow the unspoken rule. Gregory was in charge, and no one questioned him. But what Gregory didn't realize was that James had spent his career dismantling men like him, exposing corruption, and holding those who abused their power accountable.
He just didn't know it yet.
As the days passed, James began to notice patterns that others might have overlooked. He wasn't the only one receiving these ridiculous fines. An elderly widow down the street had been fined $1,200 for having a mailbox that was allegedly the wrong shade of beige. A single mother had been forced to repaint her front door 3 times because Gregory kept insisting it wasn't within the approved color palette, despite there being no record of such a rule. A military veteran had nearly lost his home after being fined into financial hardship over leaves in his yard, leaves that had blown over from Gregory's own tree. But the real kicker? Gregory's friends, the ones who attended his weekend barbecues and HOA board meetings, never received a single violation. Their yards were cluttered, their fences chipped and unpainted, but not once did a fine appear in their mailboxes. It was clear, the HOA's rules were not about maintaining community standards, they were about control, about keeping certain people in check while allowing others to break the very rules being enforced. James had spent decades studying power dynamics, and he recognized one when he saw it. Gregory was nothing more than a petty tyrant, using the HOA as his personal playground. James Carter was not a man who reacted with anger. He was a man who planned. Instead of storming into the HOA office demanding answers, he did what he did best. He gathered evidence. Late at night, he sat at his desk, flipping through the HOA bylaws, scanning every line with the precision of a prosecutor preparing for trial. It didn't take long to find what he was looking for. There was no rule about wind chimes. In fact, The bylaws were filled with vague wording, allowing Gregory to interpret them however he pleased. But what truly caught James's attention was something far more sinister, a discrepancy in the HOA's financial reports. Homeowners were being fined thousands of dollars every year, yet there were no visible improvements in the neighborhood. The roads had cracks, the community pool had been closed for repairs for over a year, and the playground was falling apart. If these fines were meant to be used for upkeep, then where was the money going? That was the moment James knew this wasn't just about an overzealous HOA president. This was about corruption. And if there was one thing James Carter couldn't stand, it was a man who used power for personal gain at the expense of others. The first confrontation between James and Gregory was not a heated argument, not a scene of shouting neighbors or raised voices. No, it was something far more unnerving, a quiet, calculated conversation that left Gregory rattled in a way he hadn't been in years. It happened one morning when James, coffee in hand, walked up to Gregory's golf cart as he was issuing yet another fine. "Morning, Mr. Miles," James said smoothly, holding up the violation notice for his wind chimes. Gregory barely looked up, smirking as he muttered, "Rules are rules, Mr. Carter. Should have read them before moving in." James chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, I did. Read every single page last night, actually. Funny thing, I couldn't find a single mention of wind chimes. But I did find something else. Did you know that Section 3.5 of the bylaws states that no structure may exceed a certain height? That would include, say, an unapproved gazebo." Gregory's smirk faltered, his fingers tightening around his clipboard. "That's different," he muttered. "I had prior approval." James raised a brow. "Did you?" "Because I checked the approval records this morning, and I couldn't find your application." There was a moment of silence, a flicker of something in Gregory's eyes. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear. He wasn't used to being questioned, and certainly not by someone who came armed with knowledge and confidence. But he recovered quickly, straightening his shoulders. "Look, Mr. Carter, you can either pay the fine or file an appeal, but I wouldn't waste your time. I always win." James smiled, slow and knowing. "We'll see about that." And with that, he walked away, leaving Gregory standing there, for the first time, feeling the uncomfortable weight of being challenged. But this was only the beginning. James had no intention of stopping at a mere confrontation. He had seen enough in his career to know that corruption, once exposed, had a way of unraveling faster than anyone anticipated. Over the next few days, he began speaking to neighbors, gathering their stories, documenting every fine, every inconsistency, every dollar that had vanished without a trace. What he found was worse than he imagined. Gregory hadn't just been issuing unfair fines, he had been pocketing a significant portion of the money. The community's funds, meant for maintenance and improvements, had been funneled into personal expenses. Gregory had been stealing from the very people he was supposed to serve. And now, James had the evidence to prove it. The question wasn't whether Gregory would go down. It was simply a matter of how hard the fall would be. And James Carter had every intention of making sure it was a fall Gregory would never recover from. James Carter had seen corruption in many forms during his career, but there was something particularly distasteful about a man who exploited his own neighbors for personal gain. Gregory Miles wasn't just an arrogant HOA president. He was a manipulator, a con man who had built his power on the fear and silence of those around him. But James wasn't afraid, and he certainly wasn't silent. If Gregory wanted to play games, he had picked the wrong opponent. Over the next few days, James deepened his investigation, combing through financial records, speaking with longtime residents, and meticulously documenting every violation Gregory had ignored for himself and his close allies. The pattern was undeniable. Gregory's friends enjoyed immunity while everyone else lived under the constant threat of fines. But more importantly, James discovered something far worse than selective enforcement. He found missing money. Thousands of dollars collected in fines had simply vanished from the HOA's financial reports, and the neighborhood had nothing to show for it. The pool remained empty, the roads were cracked, and the playground was falling apart. James had spent years building cases against criminals, and this This was a classic case of financial fraud. He just needed the right moment to strike. The opportunity came sooner than expected. As if sensing the growing unrest in the neighborhood, Gregory doubled down on his tactics, issuing more fines than ever before. James woke up one morning to 6 new violations, each one more ridiculous than the last. His driveway was suddenly deemed non-compliant. His mailbox was not in regulation with HOA aesthetic guidelines, despite being identical to his neighbors. Even his American flag was flagged as a visual disturbance. It was laughable. Gregory was panicking, trying to break James down with an avalanche of bureaucracy. But James had spent decades in the legal system. He knew desperation when he saw it, and more importantly, he knew that desperate men made mistakes. That night, he set up motion-activated security cameras around his property. It was a precaution he had often advised victims of harassment to take during his years as a prosecutor. And sure enough, Gregory made a mistake. At exactly 2:17 a.m., the cameras captured him sneaking onto James's property, a can of spray paint in hand, defacing his own driveway to justify the fine he had issued. The next morning, James sipped his coffee, watching the footage with a quiet smile. The HOA president had just sealed his own fate. With undeniable proof in hand, James prepared for the HOA meeting. He knew this wouldn't just be about clearing his own name. This was about exposing the corruption that had plagued the neighborhood for years. When he arrived at the clubhouse, the tension in the air was palpable. Homeowners who had once remained silent now whispered among themselves, their frustration simmering just below the surface. Gregory sat at the head of the room, his usual smug expression firmly in place, but there was something else in his eyes now, a flicker of unease. James took his seat near the front, a thick folder of evidence resting in his lap. Gregory cleared his throat, tapping his gavel for silence. "All right, next order of business, Mr. Carter's appeal. Let's make this quick." James smiled, standing slowly. "Oh, I agree, Mr. Miles. Let's make this quick." And with that, he walked to the front of the room, pulling a stack of papers from his folder. "I'd like to begin by addressing not just my own fines, but the pattern of financial misconduct that has plagued this community for years." The murmurs grew louder, homeowners shifting in their seats. Gregory's smirk faltered, but he forced a chuckle. "Mr. Carter, this is an HOA meeting, not a courtroom." James held up a sheet of paper. "Then why are there over $50,000 in fines unaccounted for in the HOA's financial records?" The room went silent. Gregory's face turned a shade paler. James continued, his voice calm but commanding. "I spent the past week reviewing the HOA's financial reports. The numbers don't add up. Thousands of dollars in fines have been collected, yet there's no record of where that money has gone. The roads are crumbling, the pool has been closed for months, and yet, somehow, our HOA president has managed to install a brand new gazebo in his backyard. Now, isn't that interesting?" The crowd erupted in whispers, eyes darting toward Gregory, who shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "This is ridiculous," Gregory scoffed, but there was no confidence in his voice now. James flipped to another document. "And then there's the matter of selective enforcement. Homeowners have been fined for minor infractions while others, specifically members of your inner circle, have been allowed to violate HOA rules without consequence. I have documented proof of this." And if that's not enough, he pulled out a USB drive, holding it up for all to see. "I also have security footage of Mr. Miles vandalizing my property to justify one of his fraudulent fines." Gasps rippled through the room. Gregory's face was now fully drained of color. "This is a setup," he barked, slamming his fist on the table. James tilted his head. "Then by all means, let's allow law enforcement to decide." The meeting spiraled into chaos. Homeowners who had once been afraid to speak up now stood, shouting their grievances. A single mother demanded a refund for the fines that had nearly bankrupted her. An elderly couple tearfully recounted how they had been threatened with foreclosure over a minor paint color violation. The room, once held under Gregory's control, had turned against him. And then the final blow came. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a single business card, placing it on the table in front of Gregory. "This," he said smoothly, is the contact information for a state investigator. I filed a formal complaint this morning. Expect a visit soon. Gregory shot to his feet, his face twisted with rage. You don't know who you're messing with, Carter. James chuckled, shaking his head. Oh, Gregory. That's where you're wrong. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. By the next morning, the entire neighborhood knew the truth. Gregory Miles had spent years terrorizing his community, believing himself untouchable. But the thing about corruption is that it always collapses under the weight of its own arrogance. Within days, an official investigation was launched. Gregory was removed from his position as HOA president, and his allies quickly abandoned him. But the story didn't end there. James wasn't just interested in seeing Gregory lose power, he wanted justice. Working alongside a team of homeowners, he helped initiate a class action lawsuit, ensuring that every resident who had been unfairly fined received a refund. And as for Gregory, the investigation revealed years of financial fraud, and soon enough, law enforcement stepped in. The once untouchable HOA president found himself facing charges of embezzlement, fraud, and harassment. And as he was led away in handcuffs, James Carter stood watching, his expression unreadable. He had fought many battles in his life, but this one had been personal. A month later, as James sat on his porch, sipping his coffee in the quiet morning air, a neighbor walked up, smiling. I just wanted to say thank you, she said softly, for standing up to him, for fighting for all of us. James nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. No need to thank me, he said. Sometimes, you just have to remind people that power only lasts as long as others allow it. And with that, he leaned back in his chair, finally able to enjoy the peace he had fought so hard to restore.